Let's start with a question. What would you do if you spent your own money flying to a city that isn't even your hometown, ran a completely free football camp for hundreds of kids who wouldn't otherwise get that kind of opportunity, and the response from a chunk of the local media was to look for an angle to tear it apart? Most people would probably clap back on social media, say something they'd regret, and move on. Shedeur Sanders did something completely different. He made a list, and then he read it out loud, on camera, for the world to hear. This story is being framed as a media beef, a private jet controversy, a young quarterback with thin skin who can't handle criticism. None of that is the real story. The real story starts about a year before any of this happened, in a Cleveland neighborhood where families lost everything and a man lost his life. And once you connect that timeline to what Shedeur did last week, the whole picture changes completely. Stay with me, because this one goes deeper than the headline. Shedeur had been off the grid, off Twitter, away from the noise, doing his thing privately the way a lot of players do during the offseason when they're trying to actually focus on football instead of the constant churn of takes and hot opinions. When he came back online, one of the first things waiting for him was Rex Ryan, former NFL head coach, current ESPN personality, taking a shot at a free football camp that Shedeur had just thrown for kids in Cleveland. Stop and sit with that for a second. Not a shot at his mechanics, not a critique of his decision-making in a 2-minute drill. A shot at a free football camp for kids. That was the moment, according to Shedeur himself, that something clicked. Now, a lot of players in that position go straight to the quote tweet war. They fire back, the internet eats it up for 48 hours, and then everyone moves on to the next thing. That's the predictable path. Shedeur didn't take it. Instead, he made a conscious, calculated decision about who gets his attention and who doesn't going forward. And then he said it directly, publicly, with names attached. He called out Mary Kay Cabot. He called out Tony Rizzo. And then he got to Tony Grossi, referencing him by that nickname that basically captures the reputation Grossi has built over the years. The one where nobody's ever quite good enough, where every move needs a catch, where praise comes wrapped in a but. You can hear Shedeur almost pause before he lands on it, like he's choosing his words precisely, and then he just says it plainly. No more Grossi. Done. That's the end of that relationship as far as he's concerned. Now, here's why that moment matters way beyond a typical media spat. This isn't a frustrated athlete venting at one guy over one bad take on a slow news day. This is a young player making a deliberate, public declaration about who gets a platform in his world from here on out. He said directly that he's shifting toward independent voices, people who actually show up and do the real work, over what he sees as the old guard radio and TV names, who mostly show up to complain. For a player this early in his career to make that kind of statement that clearly and that specifically, it tells you this wasn't an emotional reaction. This was a decision he'd already made. Rex Ryan just gave him the final nudge to say it out loud. Here's where the media framing already started going sideways before this situation even fully developed. The moment the words private jet entered the conversation, a portion of the coverage locked onto that detail and ran with it in exactly the direction you'd expect. Diva behavior, unnecessary flex, a backup quarterback with an attitude problem, spending money on luxury travel. That is not remotely what happened. Here's what actually went down. The previous offseason, Shedeur had told Cleveland media directly and publicly that he and Deshaun Watson were putting in work together as teammates, intentionally building that quarterback relationship, investing time in it, tuning it seriously. He made that known. He put that out there. So when it came time to get from Miami back to Cleveland quickly enough to keep that commitment and also make sure he showed up for the camp he'd promised the community, he spent his own money on a private flight to make the timeline work.
That's not a flex. That's a guy honoring his word to a teammate and to a community simultaneously, using his own money to do it when a commercial flight simply wouldn't have made the schedule work. That context, that the whole reason he was flying private was to keep promises he had already made publicly, somehow didn't make it into most of the coverage, which tells you something. It tells you what certain outlets were looking for in this story and what they weren't. They found the angle they wanted and stopped digging the moment they had enough to build a headline around it. The full context would have required a little more work and produced a significantly less spicy take, so the full context got left out. Let's talk about what was actually happening in Cleveland before any of this media noise started, because this is the part that's getting buried deepest, and it's also the most important part. Shedeur Sanders running a free football camp in Cleveland is not a new thing. This was year 2. Last year, he did this for the first time, and more than 500 kids came through, completely free of charge. No ticket price, no pay-to-play structure, just a young quarterback opening the doors to a community that doesn't typically get access to this kind of experience. And then this year, he came back. Same city, same energy, same commitment. Now here's the detail you really need to sit with. Shedeur Sanders is not from Ohio. He has said that himself. There is no requirement, no obligation, no contract clause, no hometown connection forcing a young quarterback to fly in on his own money and run a free camp for kids in a city he got drafted to. He chose to do that. Twice, back-to-back years, without being asked, without a press release demanding coverage, without making a spectacle of it. In a healthier media environment, that's a feel-good story that gets run enthusiastically. Young quarterback, 5th-round pick, not the guy handed the keys on draft night, quietly gives back to a community for the 2nd straight year. That writes itself. That gets pushed, shared, celebrated. Instead, according to Shedeur's account of what he heard from certain Cleveland media figures, Rizzo suggested he needed to stop doing so much marketing outside of football. Kat put out the take that he came on too strong during OTAs. Find the angle, any angle. Turn the positive into a negative, find the catch, make sure nobody walks away from the story with a but attached to it somewhere. Now, I want to be precise here, because I always try to give you the separation between what's confirmed and what's one person's characterization of events. What's confirmed is that Shedeur ran the camp, flew private to do it, named these specific media members publicly, and said he's done engaging with them. His explanation for why he believes their criticism showed up the way it did, that's his read on what's in someone else's head. It's a read that makes sense given the pattern he lays out, but it is still his perspective and not something any of us can independently verify from the outside. Keep that in mind as the rest of this comes together, because here's where the story stops being about a media beef and starts being about something a whole lot heavier. Rewind back roughly 1 year from this camp, June 23rd, Cleveland's Garden Valley neighborhood. What happened there was not a minor incident. This was not the kind of story you scroll past. An explosion and fire through that community. More than 40 families got displaced overnight, multiple people ended up hospitalized, and a man who by every account acted heroically during the chaos, trying to help people get out, lost his life doing it. This happened in a neighborhood full of working families, full of kids, full of people who didn't have the resources to simply absorb something like this and move on. And according to Shedeur, residents had reportedly flagged a gas leak before the explosion happened and were essentially told there was nothing to worry about. That specific detail, the reported leak flagged ahead of time, comes from Shedeur's account of events. I want to be upfront about that because that's how I do things here. When something is one person's characterization versus something independently verified, you deserve to know which one you're hearing. So keep that framing in mind. What isn't disputed is what happened after. Shedeur ran the camp, flew private to do it, named these specific media members publicly, and said he's done engaging with them. His explanation for why he believes their criticism showed up the way it did, that's his read on what's in someone else's head. It's a read that makes sense given the pattern he lays out, but it is still his perspective and not something any of us can independently verify from the outside. Keep that in mind as the rest of this comes together, because here's where the story stops being about a media beef and starts being about something a whole lot heavier. Rewind back roughly 1 year from this camp, June 23rd, Cleveland's Garden Valley neighborhood. What happened there was not a minor incident. This was not the kind of story you scroll past. An explosion and fire through that community. More than 40 families got displaced overnight. Multiple people ended up hospitalized, and a man who by every account acted heroically during the chaos, trying to help people get out, lost his life doing it.
This happened in a neighborhood full of working families, full of kids, full of people who didn't have the resources to simply absorb something like this and move on. And according to Shedeur, residents had reportedly flagged a gas leak before the explosion happened and were essentially told there was nothing to worry about. That specific detail, the reported leak flagged ahead of time, comes from Shedeur's account of events. I want to be upfront about that because that's how I do things here. When something is one person's characterization versus something independently verified, you deserve to know which one you're hearing. So keep that framing in mind. What isn't disputed is what happened after. Shedeur ran the camp, flew private to do it, named these specific media members publicly, and said he's done engaging with them.
Meanwhile, according to Shedeur, the major Cleveland stations, the same ones that were tracking his every practice repetition and every outfit during OTAs, didn't push out a donation link, didn't run a community segment, didn't do a thank you piece about the man who lost his life trying to save others. A neighborhood full of displaced families, a genuine local tragedy with real loss of life, and the stations with the biggest platforms and the loudest voices in that market were, in his telling, silent. That is the pattern Shedeur is pointing at, and it's important that you understand what he's actually saying, because this gets misread constantly. He is not saying nobody is allowed to critique his football. He's not saying his performance is off limits, or his decision-making on the field should be treated like it's above analysis. He said specifically that football criticism is completely fair game. That's what sports media is supposed to do. What he's pointing at is something more specific and more damning than general negativity. He's saying that the same voices who went quiet during an actual local tragedy in their own backyard turned around and were loudest the moment he did something genuinely good for that same community. That's not just a bad take. If the pattern holds up the way he describes it, that's a values problem. That's a question of what these outlets actually think their job is. Here's what gives this situation real weight beyond Shedeur's own words. An independent Cleveland creator who goes by Chef Z backed up the broader pattern in real time. According to Chef Z, Shedeur has been consistently showing up for this community since he arrived in Cleveland, a charity event connected to the Garden Valley situation that barely got coverage until after the fact. Camps, giveaways, and according to Chef Z, even car giveaways that never got picked up by the major stations, never got a segment, never got acknowledged on air in any meaningful way. When Shedeur heard that corroboration from someone actually plugged into the Cleveland community on the ground, his reaction was essentially relief, like confirmation that he wasn't imagining the pattern, like somebody else who was actually out there watching what was happening in real time was seeing the exact same thing he'd been noticing from his side. That matters because it shifts this from a personal grievance into something closer to a documented pattern. When multiple independent voices covering the same city all independently arrive at the same conclusion about what's getting covered and what isn't, that's harder to dismiss than one frustrated athlete venting about his press coverage. And then Deion Sanders retweeted the whole situation. Think about what that actually means for a second. This isn't just Shedeur's frustration floating out there in isolation, waiting to be written off as rookie sensitivity. His father, a Hall of Fame player who has navigated sports media across multiple decades, in multiple sports, in multiple markets, looked at this same situation and felt strongly enough to amplify it publicly. Deion Sanders has seen every version of media coverage that exists. He's been covered when he was the hero, when he was the villain, when he was the story, and when he was the supporting character in someone else's story. He's been around this long enough to know the difference between a young player overreacting and a young player pointing at something real. He co-signed it. That's not nothing. That's significant. Let's zoom out from Shedeur specifically for a moment, because there's a larger conversation happening here that goes beyond Cleveland and beyond these three names. Around this league, more and more players are doing exactly what Shedeur just did publicly. They're cutting ties with traditional media voices while redirecting their time and their platform toward independent creators and podcasters who they feel actually put in the work to understand the full story, rather than chasing whatever generates the most engagement on a slow Wednesday.
This is not an isolated move. This is a shift, and it's been building for a while. Think about what the media landscape actually looked like for athletes even 15 years ago. If you were a starting quarterback and you wanted to get your side of a story out, your options were a scripted press conference where every answer gets clipped to a soundbite, or a sit-down interview that gets edited down to whatever serves the narrative the outlet was already building. You had almost no ability to control your own context. You said something in a locker room, it went through 3 layers of filtering before it reached the audience, and by the time it got there, it might not have resembled what you actually said at all.
Now a player can pick up his phone, go live, speak directly to millions of people with zero editing, zero filtering, zero middleman cutting his words down to the 15 seconds that fit the story someone else was already writing. That is an enormous shift in leverage, and the players who understand that leverage and use it deliberately, not just to vent in the moment, but to make strategic, intentional decisions about who gets their time and who doesn't. Those players are operating in a fundamentally different relationship with media than any generation before them. What Shedeur did wasn't just a frustrated reaction, it was a demonstration of that leverage used deliberately. He didn't need Rizzo's platform, he didn't need Grossi's column, he didn't need Kat's segment to get his message out. He went direct, named names, provided context, and the story traveled everywhere without any of those 3 people being involved in distributing it. That's the new reality. And some corners of traditional sports media haven't fully reckoned with what it means for how they need to operate going forward. Let's bring this back to the ground level, because there are real, practical consequences to what Shedeur just did that go beyond the cultural conversation. He is heading into a training camp where he is actively competing for a starting quarterback position. He is under a microscope for every single rep, every single throw, every single decision he makes on a football field. That scrutiny was already going to be intense. Now he's added a layer on top of it where 3 of the media members covering his football closely have been publicly called out by name. That creates a genuinely complicated dynamic that doesn't just disappear because the news cycle moves on. Every press conference going forward, there's an elephant in the room. The reporters who weren't named are going to be paying attention to how he treats them differently from how he treats the ones he called out. Fans are going to be watching every interaction and every media availability, looking for tension, looking for awkward moments, looking for signs of whether Grossi, Rizzo, or Kat are covering him with a chip on their shoulder now. That kind of background noise is a real thing to manage in the middle of a quarterback competition. Some players would let it become a distraction. Based on everything we've seen from Shedeur going all the way back to his college career, he doesn't appear to be built that way. If anything, the pattern with him has been that external friction tends to sharpen his focus rather than scatter it. A chip on his shoulder has historically been productive fuel, but that's still a thing he has to manage, and it's worth acknowledging that he added it to his plate deliberately, which tells you how seriously he takes the underlying principle. The Cleveland fan base is split on this too, and I think that split is worth understanding because it's not a clean divide. You've got longtime Browns fans who have watched this same media ecosystem cover this franchise through years of quarterback instability and roster chaos, and a lot of them have their own long-standing frustrations with certain coverage patterns that have absolutely nothing to do with Shedeur specifically. For those fans, this moment feels like validation, like someone finally said out loud what a portion of the fan base has been grumbling about privately for years. Then you've got the other group, fans who think, regardless of the merits, a young quarterback who hasn't played a full NFL season picking public fights with veteran media figures is a risky look, that the smart play is always to let your performance on the field speak and let the criticism roll off, rather than turning it into a public standoff that follows you. Both of those perspectives have real merit. Media scrutiny at this level is part of the job. Full stop, and there's no version of being a starting quarterback in a market like Cleveland where you get to opt out of that reality entirely. But the specific thing Shedeur is pointing at, silence during a community tragedy paired with volume during a community celebration, that's a different conversation than general media toughness, and conflating them misrepresents what he actually said. Step all the way back and look at the full picture, because I think the actual story here is getting buried under the easier story, and that's worth calling out directly. A fifth-round pick, not the guy the franchise built their future around, not the highly touted prospect handed a guaranteed starting job, has quietly shown up for a city that isn't even his hometown for 2 straight years. He ran free camps. He showed up during a genuine community tragedy without a camera crew. He's been doing the work that nobody was putting on the front page, and when the moment came where the media coverage of a positive act he did for that same community felt backwards to him, he didn't explode. He made a calculated decision, and he stated it clearly. The private jet isn't the story. The camp is the story. The Garden Valley explosion is the story. The gap between what got covered loudly and what got covered quietly, or not at all, that's the story. And Shedeur Sanders naming names publicly in a way that forced that gap into a conversation it wouldn't otherwise have had, that might end up being the most significant part of all of it. Because this doesn't just fade once the news cycle turns over. Once you draw a line this publicly, with this much specificity tied to something as serious as a community tragedy in a year-long pattern of what you saw covered and what you didn't, it becomes part of the permanent record. Every time those names cover a Browns story going forward, this conversation comes back. Every time Shedeur does something in the community, people are going to remember who showed up and who didn't. That's the receipt, and now everybody has it.